Good morning, everybody. Here we go again. The question I'm asked more than anything else in all the time that I've been here is, why is the priest house called the priest house? This should be a straightforward answer, but unfortunately, it is never that easy. There are really two answers, the short answer and the long answer. Normally, I only have time for the short answer. Today, you're going to get the long answer. So I hope everyone's sitting comfortably. So I will begin. The first record of anyone living in this area really goes back to the Mesolithic period. We have records of flints being found in the valley south of here. But the first documentary evidence starts in 765, when Eadwulf, one of the last kings of the South Saxons, granted land to his thane Hunlaf to build a monastery. This became the monastery of St. Michael's at South Malling. To support the monastery, he gave land that began at Stanmer, worked north through Linfield and came right up to the High Weald. The charter mentions the clearing of Chitta's people, which is Chiddingly, probably just south of where the house is now. The Wellinga Stane, which has been translated as being Stonehurst, but it might well be Big upon Little itself. There's a reference to somewhere that might be Barleylands, which is the original name for Philpotts, although again, probably south of where Philpotts is now. And you have the clearing of the Halfakungas, and that is the first reference to West Hoathly itself. We don't know exactly where that clearing was, but on the western side of the village, certainly, because all these places are on the western side, probably to the west of Hook Lane, maybe just north of Hook Farm itself. This was swine pasture. This was listed as swine pasture, and they brought the pigs here because of the beech mast and the oak mast. So that is the earliest reference. And it is then possible to fast forward 300 years to 1066 and all that, when really nothing had changed. South Malling still had the western side of the village. It was still being used as pig pasture. There were probably charcoal burners here, but very little else here. Who owned the rest of the village, we don't know. It may have been one of the thanes who died at the Battle of Hastings. We really don't know. We know that after the battle, William the Conqueror gave the rape of Lewis, which is what we're in, to William de Warenne, who definitely was at Hastings. William de Warenne was one of William the Conqueror's closest friends. William de Warenne gave the land to Ralph de Cheyne, or de Cheney, however you want to pronounce it. The family give their name to Horsted Keynes and Milton Keynes. It's the same family. First thing he did was order the building of a church. So 1092, they started to build the first church here. And some of it still remains, of course, opposite the cat, part of the original church remains. To support the church, to provide an income for the church, he gave an area of land, which became the manor of the rectory of West Hoathly. We don't know the exact bounds of that manor in those days. The western boundary was probably about 100 yards behind the house here, but north and south and east, we don't know. It might have stretched all the way to the forest. Really don't know, but certainly smaller than the modern parish was. When he built the church, Ursula Ridley says that he gave it to the Cluniac Priory in Lewes by pinning the deed of gift to their high altar with his dagger. Where she got that from, we don't know. It's possible, but the high altar in those days was not going to be very impressive because the Priory Church at Lewes was tiny. It had only been founded by William de Warenne and his wife Gundrada in 1082. So it was only a small new house in those days. It was one of 30 daughters of Cluny in this country. They owed their allegiance directly to their great abbey at Cluny in Burgundy. It was the discovery of William de Warenne and Gundrada's bones that led to the foundation of the Sussex Archaeological Society in 1846. So they did come back to sort of rather to support us again. The Cluny house, was the biggest of all of the 30 daughters in Sussex, but it did own its allegiance directly to France. The priors were always French, most of the monks would be French, and this did cause them problems, of course, in England at that time. And at some point in the 13th century, they lost the land in West Hoathly and one or two other of their estates throughout Sussex. We don't know why this happened. We don't know what they did. But at some point they lost the land, and the land that was the manor of West Hoathly was given back to the canons of South Morling. So this became part of the manor of Linfield at that point. But in 1377, there were raids by French pirates on the Sussex coast at Rottingdean. The prior of Lewes rode out to confront the pirates, but was captured. He was ransomed, and the ransom nearly bankrupted the priory. So to compensate them for this, in 1390, the Pope gave them back the manor of the rectory of West Hoathly and their lands in Wivelsfield, Patcham and Ditchling. So they got their lands back. They didn't do much with them, unfortunately. Running their lands closer to Lewes shouldn't have been a problem, but up here on the high weald, just the transport, the movement was so difficult that they couldn't get here. They did not look after the land. The 14-mile journey there and back probably took 2 or 3 days. Even if you did most of it by boat, which was the easiest way to travel around Sussex in those days, it would have taken too long for a tenant in West Hoathly to go to Lewes, sort out his complaint and come back again. He did not have that time. So in 1426, the parishioners from West Hoathly and the other parishes clubbed together and wrote a letter of complaint to the Vatican. And that letter still exists. It's still in the Vatican records today. We don't have the reply. We don't know what was said, but we know what happened in West Hoathly at least. They built a large house to dominate this end of the village in order to run it from the village itself, and installed probably a bailiff or steward to live in the house and look after the land. There may have been monks here periodically, but we don't think they were here permanently. We don't think the priest lived in the house that they built. We don't know where he did live. Kay Coutin thinks he lived in a chamber in the church itself, which is perfectly possible. Kay knows an awful lot more about church architecture than I do, but he didn't live in the house that they built to run the land. And at that point, it was probably called something like the priory's house or the monk's house, or possibly the bailiff's house, as he was the person who lived here. It stayed this way for about 100 years, but in 1524, the priory leased the land to the Brown family, who were a local farming family, well established in the village at that time. And they paid their rent, they paid their tithes directly to the priory. But in 1536, Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell came along. The priory was forced to surrender in 1537. Thomas Cromwell targeted the priory specifically because it was the largest house in Sussex. He wanted to teach the others a lesson, show them that Lewes could not survive. So he sent his architect, whose name I will have to check, who was Giovanni Portinari, Italian architect and engineer. He sent him down to Lewes to destroy the priory, and he did a very thorough job. The priory church at that time had grown somewhat. It was something like 430 feet long, so it was larger than Chichester Cathedral. And Portinari is believed to have completely destroyed it in 14 days by undermining the walls and collapsing the church itself. Most of the rest of the priory was dismantled. Part of it survived, and Thomas Cromwell's son lived in part of it for a little while. The rest of it was sold off in bits and pieces. The lead work, the glass was recycled, and the stone was sent all over Lewes. So Southover Grange is made almost entirely from stones from Lewes Priory. Thomas Cromwell was given this land. He never knew anything about it, but he did hold the manor of the rectory of West Hoathly for a short while before he lost his head in 1540. The land then became part of the divorce settlement of Anne of Cleves. She never came here either. The Browns kept paying their rent. It really didn't make an awful lot of difference to them who they were paying their rent to. When Anne died, 1557, the land reverted to the crown. So Queen Mary had it for about a year. When she died, the land went to Elizabeth. Elizabeth took a slightly different view of things. She liked the ready cash. She had expensive tastes in dresses. So she's supposed to have sold the manor of West Hoathly to pay her dressmaker's bill. She sold it to two property speculators called Nicholas Pind and Thomas Reeve. And they came knocking on the Browns' door and basically told them that they were going to buy the land, the manor of West Hoathly, and their house. If they didn't buy it, someone else would. So the Browns had to take the large step of buying their property, and they struggled. It was a big step for them. They had to sell off some of their land. Oh, sorry, that's my phone. This is always going to happen one of these things. So we're going to have to let the answer machine run down. Can you hear that?
Yes, but it's kind of quite vague.
Right, okay.
You
Yeah, sorry.
carry on over the top.
Right, okay. It's going to stop now because nobody leave a message. Sorry about that. It was going to happen one day. It isn't the mobile phone. I have not left the mobile phone on. I just can't turn off the landline that easily. Where was I? Yes, Pind and Reeve sold the manor to the Browns. They had to speculate, selling off future income of the land to their neighbours in order to be able to buy it in the first place. But they did recover, and we know they'd recovered sufficiently by 1580 or so because they'd modernized. They built chimneys here. We know they had chimneys because in Thomas Brown's will of 1581, there were fire plates, which are fire backs, and you don't have fire backs unless you have chimneys to lean them against. So they'd modernized by that period. So by the end of the 16th century, the Browns were at their peak. Their house was at its peak, and it may well have been known as the Browns' house at that point. Everybody knew the Browns lived here. Everybody knew where everybody lived in the village. You didn't really need an address. It was just their house. The Browns were doing quite well at that stage, but throughout the 17th century, they began to struggle. They got themselves deeper and deeper into debt. They appear in many court records towards the end of the 17th century. But in 1695, their creditors finally caught up with them, and they had to sell. The land was bought by Sir Francis Isles on behalf of his cousin, who was Anna Hooper, who just married the Attorney General of Barbados, and she was looking for a land to invest in this country. Why he chose this land, we don't know. It wasn't a great investment, but she tried to improve things by splitting the house into two cottages. So you had two tenant farmers living here at that point. You have the Parks family in one end and the Payne family in the other. And they were the first in a long line of tenant farmers and farm labourers who lived in the Priory's old house over a period of 200 years. Anna Hooper died in 1715, but her affairs were so complicated that her land wasn't sold off until 1731, when Robert Bostock, who lived near Oxford, near Maidstone in Kent, bought the land, again, purely as an investment. He really didn't do anything with it at all. Basic maintenance of the properties, never modernized, didn't touch the properties at all. So that is why there are so many old buildings in this village that have not been modernized. It's largely down to the Bostock's neglect. It did mean that by the end of the 19th century, they were basically all slums, farm labourers' cottages. They were all in a very bad way. This one in particular had holes in the roof and holes in the walls and broken windows. Even the Great House or the Manor House had weeds growing up through the ground floor in places. So none of the buildings were being maintained. In 1895, the land was bought by John Cotton Powell, who lived at Selsfield. He was a London wine merchant, but he did nothing to maintain the houses either. So they continued in their very poor state of repair. And many of them, like this one, were very close to collapse. And throughout this period, you will not find any mention of the priest house at all. Now, everything I've told you is, as far as I know, true. But we can't prove that any of it actually relates to the building that I'm sitting in. Because, as I say, there are no mentions of the priest house until around 1900. At that stage, John Godwin King comes in. He lived at Stonelands, and in 1905, he bought what was left of the manor of West Hoathly, which included this building and the great house and many of the other old buildings around the village. And he set about modernizing them. And this one he opened as his own museum in 1908, and he christened it the Priest House. He may have had some documents to back this up. We don't know why. Village tradition backed it up. The actual building itself backed it up. This fits very closely with the story that I've just told, from the construction date, the type of construction, the modernization in the 16th century, the division at the end of the 17th century, the decline and almost ruin in the 19th century. It is perfect for this building. But as I say, there are no documents to back this up. What we do have is this. I'm going to have to lift this up, and I apologize because it is very heavy. There we go. This is part, it's a reflection. This is part of the original wall. This is 15th century wattle and daub. So it is basically clay and cow dung. And carved in it, you can see a cross. This is a cross potent, also known as a crutch cross, rather less poetically, sometimes known as the cross of Jerusalem, although the cross of Jerusalem is normally slightly different to this one. It is a very early form of cross. It is quite a rare one, particularly in the Anglican Church. You don't see it very often, and there is absolutely no reason why a layman would have this carved in his house. This really has to come from a religious building. So the long answer to why the priest house is called the priest house is because of this. This is what makes this building the one that was built by Lewis Priory in around 1430, lived in by the Brown family, owned by Anna Hooper, owned by the Bostocks, rescued by John Godwin King. This is why the priest house is the priest house. And I said it was a long answer. And thank you very much for listening. And I'm going to put this down because it's heavy.